All right, so today's lecture is going to cover most of everything I want to talk about with Kant. And this is something I've been working on for years, and this is going to be the most of it, okay? Um, if we remember the last three videos that I shot, we talked about a few things, right? And I'm just going to broadly outline what I was talking about in the last three videos. If you remember the first video, what I was talking about is I was talking about a degree of understanding. And I was talking about, you could understand something very lightly or you could understand something very well. Okay. And then the second video, we talked about, we did like a modern philosophy, a modern philosophy crash course, right? And we talked about Rene Descartes, David Hume, and Immanuel Kant, right? And we said that Rene Descartes and David Hume was transcendental realists. And then we said that Kant was coming up with transcendental idealism, right? He kind of put those two together. And then the last video that I shot before this, I was talking about how we are, I'm going to say, in a way, creating the a priori analytic and the a posteriori synthetic, okay? And we'll talk about the word create later. But we talked about those three things, and this one's gonna tie all three of those videos together, and we'll cover even more ground going forward. So before we get back into all that stuff, I just want to talk about a few things, okay? So in the last video, I talked about knowledge, right? And knowledge was a priori and knowledge was a posterior, okay? And then we talked about judgments. I kind of like, I don't like using the words because it kind of like confuses people, as you know. It's not the easiest thing to kind of accept, but I think by the end of this video, I don't want us to even think of the words, but have a tight grip on understanding all the stuff that we're talking about. Okay, so don't get bogged down by the words. Just try to have some type of meaning to yourself that it means something, or you're grasping it in some type of way. Okay. The only thing you kind of got to remember is the a priori analytic. When I say the a priori analytic, just think about space. Okay, space in its most simplistic form. Okay, or complex, whatever. When I say the a posteriori synthetic, what I mean is our unlimited experience, right? Our experience limits things, and the a posterior synthetic is unlimited. Like if we were to think of something that was unlimited of our experience, that is the a posteriori synthetic. Okay. But judgments are the later parts of those two things that we talked about. The a priori is knowledge. The analytic is a judgment, right? The a posterior is a knowledge, and synthetic is a judgment, right? So judgments are the later parts of those types of things, right? Analytic, synthetic. So try to remember, in his first critique, he's talking about judgments as analytic and synthetic. Later, judgments are something that is grounded. Okay, before we really get into judgment, I just want to talk about Kant in a broader sense, okay? So, during Kant's career of writing, he had three major works, and his three major works were called The Critique of Pure Reason. The second one was The Critique of Practical Reason, and the third one was The Critique of Judgment, okay? And you gotta notice that they're all headed with the title, critique of, right? And the way we're gonna look at this in a broad sense is that when he writes these major works, is he's talking about moments of synthesis, okay? And we could say that the critique of pure reason, he talks about pure reason as something that could be critiqued, right? And we could just put that with the other two, the critique of practical reason. The practical reason is something to be critiqued, and the critique of judgment is something to be critiqued, right? And so all these moments, right, can be critiqued, right? And that's the way Kant kind of sets up his three critiques. This was roughly a 10-year span. He wrote his first one, and then the third one 10 years later, and with one in the middle, all right, in the late 1700s. What I want to draw attention to is the word judgment for a second. And judgment in the first critique specifically means analytic and synthetic, right? And 10 years later, judgment has a more easier way of understanding the word judgment, right? So we're going to talk about the easier way to understand judgment, and it's more of a practical way, okay? At first, judgment is just analytic tools, I guess you could say, or just tools to use with our reason, right? Or just, our way of thinking. But judgments are analytical and synthetic, okay? Later on, judgments are more of a verb where we're doing judgments, okay? We're going to start with doing judgments. But before we start doing judgments, we're going to talk about what we were talking about in the previous videos with transcendental realism and transcendental idealism, right? The differences between those two. We're going to hash those out more. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take transcendental realism and we're going to hold on to transcendental realism, and we're going to create transcendental idealism. So I'm going to use the word create in this lecture as one thing, and when we understand constitution, we're going to compare the idea of create to constitution. The difference between create and constitute is constitution has a meaning that, in a way, we are creating the world, right? Constitution has to do with a configuration, right? Constituting a configuration is something that only exists if it's being constituted, okay? So we're gonna get more into constitution, but just real quick, if you remember from the first three videos, we kind of ended the videos with the a priori analytic and the a posteriori synthetic, right? And in a way, when we look at it coming from a transcendental real perspective, we just kind of created this thing from holding on to transcendental realism, right? we created this. We want to make a move with between creating and constituting. Okay, we create the a priori analytic and the a posteriori synthetic. We're just gonna hold it there, right? And then we're gonna move our mind into something else, right? We're gonna move it into a configuration, right? So rather than these things are being created, these things already exist, okay? The a priori analytic exists, space exists, right? And an unlimited experience exists, right? In a way, but then our experience limits these things, okay? But that, in terms of a configuration, we're not creating space or the a posterior synthetic. We're not creating those things, right? Those things are just part of configuration. And constitution is the things, is you could say a mental activity that makes everything possible, right? It's constituting these things, you know. It's making the world the way it is, in a way, right? You can say constituting is the function of illuminating. I think we could say we gotta look at it in terms as there's no beginning of space, right? There's no beginning of the a priori analytic or the a posteriori synthetic, or there's no beginning to the constitution of it, right? It's always been a configurative structure of the world. So this whole thing about configuration is, if we're gonna leave it somewhere, we're gonna leave it through our consciousness. Okay, so we let the configuration be, right? And now we're gonna take the aesthetic approach, and we're gonna learn more about judgment this way, and we'll talk about other stuff too. The aesthetic approach comes to us from his third critique, right? And in his third critique, what he says is there is an object referred to the subject, right? And this is, I take this as, you know, the most simplistic thing Kant ever says, okay? The object is referred to the subject, and I want to draw attention to it, right? As definitely the simplicity of it, okay? He says the object is referred to the subject. We're going to talk about objects in terms of a configuration object, and I would say what we have already is not sufficient for us to constitute an object besides our minds only creating it, right? I would say we're in a way gonna add to our configuration, right? And the way we're gonna add to our configuration is we're gonna create another thing in the configuration to hang out with space and the a posteriori synthetic. We're gonna create the aesthetic state, okay? And then the word aesthetic, the way it's spelled is A-E-S-T-H-E-T-I-C, aesthetic. So the aesthetic state, something about the aesthetic state that you should know as we take the aesthetic approach is the aesthetic state, we cannot, we have no experience of the aesthetic state. But what we do have experience of is aesthetic objects, right? We could say that the aesthetic state is both the a priori analytic and the a posteriori synthetic together, right? We're creating another thing, right? Just like the other two. The aesthetic state. We could look at it as a triple mirror, right? In a way, if it has the same shape or form as the others, in a way of some type of modality making it possible. But the aesthetic state henceforth an aesthetic object, right? Something that the aesthetic state is on its own, like just like space is on its own, just like the a posteriori synthetic is on its own, in its entirety on its own, right? It's one of those things, but we cannot sense it. But it is space in the a posteriori synthetic, and we just created a word for something that was both separate, right? But at the same time, this thing is not. We don't have an experience of it, right? We're just thinking about it in a way where we have no real experience of the aesthetic state. We have experience of again what I'm saying is the aesthetic objects, right? The aesthetic objects in our realm of perception is being referred to us as the subject, right? The object is referred to the subject, right? We're gonna understand why there's an aesthetic state that we can't experience, but yet we're experiencing aesthetic objects, okay? The reason why is because as we constitute the configuration, right, as part of just existence itself, the configuration is bringing forth aesthetic objects, right? And we talk about an aesthetic state, but an aesthetic object is brought forth to us by the function of transcendental aesthetic, okay? The word transcendental means supreme or otherworldly. Those are the most common definitions of transcendental. So transcendental aesthetic is what brings us these aesthetic objects, okay? Something that is otherworldly or supreme is brought to our experience as an object, and we experience it as we are the subject, okay? Notice that the object's being put forth to us, right? But when I say that it's a function, I just want to say that it's a verb in a way, right? The transcendental aesthetic is a verb that's doing an action that's bringing forth this thing, right? And we constituting something also is a verb, right? But I want to say that when we constitute, we have an intention, right? We have an intention as a function in a way. And the transcendental aesthetic, in a way, when we look at it, has a function, but ultimately there's no intention of the aesthetic, transcendental aesthetic. So we're comparing constitution of the configuration with the transcendental aesthetic. That is because they're two functional things that we're comparing them. The transcendental aesthetic and constitution, they're both functions, right? So what I want to point out is we could introduce this idea of causality, right? And causality is a big one. And the way I want to talk about causality is I really got to fill in a lot of things that I did not mention earlier. So I never mentioned the word time in all my lectures. And we're going to talk about space-time and causality, right? And we did talk about space, and all I want to do with time is say that time is the a posteriori synthetic, okay? And the a posteriori synthetic is time, but in a certain way that it is not in a sequence, okay? This time is not in a sequence. Time, all I want to say about it is a faculty of knowledge. A faculty of knowledge, the way I look at faculty, is the most common way that I've seen it in my life is a school faculty, where in a university or college they have a department. So each department has a faculty of teachers who teach whatever subject it is. So the faculty is just, if we look at it in terms of the department has access to these teachers to teach these students. And the faculty of knowledge is just what you have merely as things, okay? And I don't want to put no function on this, okay? So no sequence on this, okay? Faculty of knowledge. So we have the faculty of knowledge, right? And I want to introduce to us the faculty of understanding. The faculty of understanding it has functional things in it, right? It could have functional things in it. We could strip it bare, more bare, but in general, it has functional things in it when we talk about it. The faculty of understanding, I want to look at it in terms of two functions, which is our constitution and the transcendental aesthetic, right? The transcendental aesthetic has no intentional function, but when we use it, right, when we look at it, to us, we could look at it as a function. One more thing about time is time could be looked at as raw material, okay? And anything raw has not been put or being dealt in a sequence, okay? So time is raw. Okay, so at this point of the lecture, we're gonna leave all that there and we're gonna move on, okay? Now we're gonna talk about the aesthetic approach. And the first thing I do when I talk about the aesthetic approach is talk about aesthetic rapture, okay? The word rapture means to be carried away. And the best way I could talk about rapture is talk about a word that existed before rapture, okay? In ancient Greek literature, they have what you call people who are called rhapsodes, right? R-H-A-P-S-O-D-E, rhapsodes, okay? And rhapsodes, you'll see an encounter of a rhapsode in one of the Platonic dialogues where Socrates runs into a rhapsode, right? And this rhapsode guy, he is a rhapsode for a cult, some type of religion, right? And as a rhapsode, what he does is he gives the sermon of his cult or his, divination or something. But he's given a rhapsode, and the way he describes the rhapsode is that he is being carried away by the work of God, right? So he's not really doing anything but at that point a rhapsode, but God is carrying him away, right? So that's a rhapsode. Later on, right around, I think 15, 16, 1700, okay, the word rhapsode becomes rhapsody, and we have a popular song called the Bohemian Rhapsody today, which was in the 1900s, but that's probably the most popular rap song we could probably think of today. But right around that time, around the 1700s, after Rhapsody became Rhapsody, the Germans came up with the word rapture, right? And they stuck it with the word aesthetic, okay? And when we talk about the aesthetic object being put forth to us by the transcendental aesthetic, if we recognize it or we experience it, right, and we try to just say simply we're memorizing the object or whatever, it becomes in a way vacuous, right? We can't remember things perfectly all the time, right? But we can try. So in a way, aesthetic rapture is something that is in a way supreme, right? Supreme, and it kind of, the aesthetic rapture in terms of a rhapsode kind of takes, it's a vacuous sense where we don't have control of it, okay? Aesthetic rapture. So when we experience the object, right, we're at an encounter, right? We're encountering something that the transcendental aesthetic has put forth to us. And the transcendental aesthetic is placing something, right? Or, you know, in a way, you could say, you kind of feel it as pushing into our experience something, right? And at the same time, the things that we hold on to in our experience, right, is going through, the things that we encounter is going through an aesthetic rapture, right? So there's like a push or a placement, and there's something that's vacuous, like pulling away, okay? And on our side of Constitution, right, on our side of Constitution, we are kind of doing the same thing, but we have intentions, right? We are trying to cognize things in a sequence, right? So we're kind of placing things and pushing things into our experience. And at the same time, we are also pulling or holding together still. And in that way, we're pulling against vacuousness, right? So I'm talking about four facets, right? Four facets of, I want to say simply four facets of verbs, right? And the noun is the objective experience, okay? Now, if we were to deduct the objective experience, we'll have some type of system of causality, okay? And I'm saying causality coming from the transcendental aesthetic is pushing and placing and is vacuous, right? And as Constitution with intention, it's cognizing some type of sequence and it's holding to get something that it wants to hold against the vacuousness, right? So when we deduct the experience, we still don't have a pure causality, right? Pure causality is an uninfluenced causality, right? And pure causality, I'm just talking about my experience, right? And how I am doing things with causality. Pure causality has nothing to do with that. I mean, it's anything that does not have to do with causality makes it unpure, okay? And we want to look at this purity and other things too, right? There's pure space, there's pure time, right? And we're going to say there's the pure a priori. And the pure a priori has nothing to do with anything empirical. So we just mentioned pure causality, and now we're talking about pure a priori. And pure a priori, or anything pure, cannot be altered in a sequence, right? Eventually we'll put that unpure a priori into a sequence, but for now we'll talk about sequences. To really start with sequence, we're going to look at the transcendental aesthetic bringing forth an object. And in our constitution, we encounter the object, right? And there's like this middle ground that, you know, this causality that's playing around, right? Or playing within or through or whatever. And the encounter of the constitution and the transcendental aesthetic is being held together by the synthesis of a manifold. Here we're going to introduce to us the manifold. And the manifold, you know, has to do with what we're capable of constituting or deal with the transcendental aesthetic, right? And you could look at it as perhaps metaphysical barriers in between our experience or something like that, right? But along with the transcendental aesthetic, it's putting forth things in a manifold, right? And Kant's going to say, or he's going to draw attention to that when we look at objects and we look at it in a simple object to subject distinction, he's going to say that is easier than us doing a deduction. When I say deduction, I'm going to have an example, and I'm going to use the idea of gratification. Even though gratification is perhaps the most simplest thing on side of experience, it is a synthetic deduction, right? And that's something that we have to work towards, while objects in the phenomena appear to be separate naturally because of the manifold. So gratification is a conceptualization, while experiencing separate objects is a natural experience. So gratification is the simplest thing that we have on side of our experience, but again, it came through via a deduction, right? When we extract our world and come up with gratification, we can take other extractions and configure them to work some type of concept. And we'll do that later. But to get a more valuable concept of this, I think we should put it to the side and just move away from this for a second, because this is all at the end of the lecture again. What I want to talk about now is the hardest part of the a priori. Kant's going to say about the a priori that it is not derived immediately from experience, but it's borrowed from experience, okay? So the a priori being borrowed from experience is actually harder than it sounds. And the way we're going to talk about it is we're going to look at the actual paragraph that I'm drawing it from. And I want to say that you could look at this whole lecture all the videos, the previous 3 videos, and this video as a commentary on this little paragraph that Kant writes. And he's going to explain, he doesn't explain it, but we'll see why he doesn't explain the whole thing out, because it's the very beginning of his introduction, right? The first section of his introduction. And when we read it, we're gonna be even more baffled, I would say, at first. But don't get discouraged. We're gonna talk about it because, like I said, this has been a commentary for this paragraph. Okay, the last few hours, 2 hours and 18 minutes, 19 minutes of lecture. I also want to say before we get into the paragraph that we are towards the end of the lecture, so just hold on tight. This term APRI, however, is not yet determinate enough to indicate the full meaning of our question. For it is customary to say, even with regard to some knowledge derived from empirical sources, that we have it or might partake of it a priori, because we do not derive it immediately from experience, but from a general rule, a rule which is itself, however, borrowed by us from experience. We're starting at the top, but just know that the rest of the paragraph will be threaded in the rest of the lecture. So, at the very beginning of the paragraph, right, Kant says, this term a priori, however, is not yet determinate enough, right? He's saying it's not determinate enough to indicate the full meaning of our question. So he's asking a question, but the term is not determinate enough, right? So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna figure out a way to give Kant his determinate a priori, okay? You can say from earlier, we went through some rules, right? That for us to put ourselves in a configuration, we had to create the a priori analytic and the a posterior synthetic, right? In a certain way, and then we could understand the configuration. And he's saying something similar to this. Although there are other ways to get to the configuration, I did this because I was predisposed by my understanding and values. So in a sense, in my first video, when I was saying the a priori was a degree of understanding, I want to say that understanding, that type of a priori, is borrowed from experience. The whole thing about the a priori being borrowed from experience will pop up throughout the lecture, and a lot of things will just pop up throughout the whole lecture, but get to the end of it, it'll all come together. So we're going to return to judgments for a while. Judgment, in this third critique, we're going to say that it is grounded, right? And it has to do with the phenomena, right? And also, it has to have some type of gratification for it to do a judgment. The term gratification will definitely stick with us this whole lecture. Gratification is something that is connected to the phenomenal world, and at the same time, gratification will lead us to liking something and making a judgment on our likes, okay? This is where the term judgment comes from in this third critique. Our reason comes in when we understand our likes, right? We figure out the reasons why we like something. Note this process, and we'll get back to it later. But gratification, likes, and then reason. Now we're talking about gratification and likes. There's a difference between these two seemingly similar things, but we should notice that without a like, we would possibly still have gratification, right? But without gratification, there is no likes. We're gonna keep that avenue from gratifications to likes to reason on the side, and we're just gonna follow through on the grounded side of it being attached to the phenomena. If you remember my first video, I was talking about predispositions of the APRI, right? And our predispositions back then, we were talking about understanding, right? And degrees of understanding. And again, these are borrowed from experience, right? But we're going to take predisposition and put it on this side of gratification where it's connected to the phenomena, right? And when we look at our judgments of likes, we could say that we were predisposed to like those things, okay? And again, that's going to point at something being borrowed from our experience. When you look at predispositions this way, with judgments and gratification of nature, we could look at it as data for clinical psychology. And going straight to the point is things in the phenomena, when it comes to, you could say, rules, the phenomena belongs to the natural world, right? And the natural world has rules. You could say laws or something. Laws of science all work on the phenomenal world, okay? If it's in the phenomenal world, it's following rules, and our bodies are following rules. This is not a priori. This is, you could say, a posterior for sure. What I want to say about the natural world here is that the natural world, as we have it, you know, as bare as gratification, we're going to say that there's no morality into it, right? Here, we're going to get a short discussion of where Kant talks about morality. In Kant's third critique, he talks about this facet of non-morality, and the way he talks about it is he says that you cannot charge anybody with malice, right? So you could say people could do the most hideous things, right? And you can't charge them with malice because it's mere gratification, okay? And so your gratification, you could say it has a like and a dislike, but there's no intent of living that life. When I say it's the aesthetics life, okay? There's no intent to it. Or to say it better, no reason in just gratifying what you like the most. That's just a act of science, doing science. Our phenomenal part of the world is an act of science, gratification. That right there is a determinate a posterior. And now we're going to go for a determinate a priori. If I say in my initial videos that the a priori is things like understanding and value, there's no way that is anything a posterior, right? Kant tries to separate these two in the way he does. Okay, so let's just put that to the side, right? And we'll get back to it shortly. Right now, I just want to outline the ending of this lecture. And what we're going to do is we are going to put the natural gratification into a sequence, right? We're going to alter it. And then when we have the sequence, what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at the things inside the sequence and we're gonna examine the sequence itself. You could say perhaps without the things in it. And we're examining this without looking at it. After different facets of the sequence, we're gonna talk about the concept of a sequence, right? After the different facets, we'll understand the concepts of a sequence. And with the concept of a sequence, we'll understand concepts in general. When we get concepts in general, we will arrive at the determinate a priori. And then I'm gonna say a couple things to end the video. And starting from the top of the outline, what we're gonna do first is, again, put the natural world and gratification into a sequence. So the natural world, including our gratification, is going through the motions, right? And we're gonna take that and put it into a sequence. And metaphorically or aphoristically speaking, we're gonna cast a big net, okay, out into the world. And we're gonna catch live things. And I don't mean that we're catching animals. I'm saying that in our peripheral, when we see objects on site of gratification, you could say it's live, right? And we're gonna catch these by altering our gratification. If we remember about the manifold, we could say that it is customary that when we see things in the world, that things are referred to the subject, or we separate objects from each other because the manifold has these metaphysical barriers in between our experience, right? And these things, as they seem separate from the manifold, we put them in a sequence, right? Any object can go through a sequence, okay? And we recognize different moments of the object, right? Kant's gonna use an object falling. So one moment, you notice that the object is high, and then the next moment, you notice that it's lower, and the third moment, you notice it's on the floor, right? Because our understanding or our perception is limited, we see these things as separate parts as we work with the manifold, as the manifold tries to separate these things. And it's not trying intentionally, that's just what it does, okay? When we conceptualize what a sequence is, we have a concept of the sequence, and when things move in a sequence, we say that things are falling, right? And conceptually in the sequence, we could say that it's moving side to side, right? Or you could say in a sequence that it is moving up. But when we see the objects as falling, there is some type of thing that we have some type of manifold synthesis that we're reasoning with, right? So instead of a falling object, we're gonna try something else, okay? Something more seemingly unrelated, okay? One moment, I'm in a classroom, okay? The next moment, I'm on an iceberg, okay? And then another moment, I'm on the moon, okay? And those are all seemingly unrelated, right? But when we put things in a sequence, we try to make sense of things, right? We try to make sense of how did I get from a classroom to an iceberg to the moon, right? So when we place things in a sequence, we have a conceptualization of a sequence, right? And we try to make sense of these objects in a sequence, right? So what the mind does is that, what synthesis does is that it fills in all the stuff in between the experienced objects. The concept of a sequence by rule holds the things in a manifold together. And at the same time, the rule is that it fills in all the stuff in between. The key word we want to talk about is holding, right? The concept of a sequence holds the objects and it puts it in order. The concept is not putting things in a sequence. The concept is a rule. So in the midst of everything, I'm going to give us the crutch of Kant. The concept is a rule, okay? And the rule of the concept is that it holds itself together, right? The concept holds itself together. Again, the rule and by rule by which it is itself is that it holds itself together. So if you remember space, right? And pure space was uninfluenced by anything that is not space, and the same as time, right? And then we looked at pure causality, right? These are pure states or whatever. Here we got a pure concept, okay? And this concept is an uninfluenced concept, and it's pure. By rule, one concept could tell you about other concepts. Our conception of a pure concept gives us all other concepts. We could look at the beginning of this project. When we knew the concept of space, we, in a way, went to move towards the concept of time, right? And then the concept of configuration. But the concept of space gave us everything that we needed, because the concept holds the concept together. Well, it holds all the concepts together, right? And again, one concept will tell you about other concepts. Something inside the sequence doesn't tell you anything about the other things inside the sequence or anything about the concept. Kant says throughout his books that we have an inclination to expand our experience, right? And he would say that this experience is not of the sequential experience. It's not of the phenomena. Kant is one of those conservation of matter persons where he says that matter cannot be created or destroyed, but we can't expand matter, but what we can do is expand our conceptual experience, our degree of understanding, and our value. And that being said, I want to say that Kant doesn't create the science of concept, but he's a pioneer in the science of concepts. So we're at the last section, and we're going to deliver the determinant a priori. So we're going to talk about dialectic real quick because it's going to help us with the determinant a priori. You remember when I said that Kant wrote 3 books, right? And his 3 books were about pure reason, practical reason, and judgment, right? And I said those are moments of synthesis. But those 3, I'm going to say it's a concept of a dialect, right? We actually covered the dialectic, but I didn't mention it as I was doing the lecture. So here's the outline. The dialect, in terms to correlation to the books, we went through a progression, right? We started with gratification, and gratification refers to Kant's second critique, which was practical reason. And practical reason, again, means practical or pragma or praxis, right? That's the same as physis or nature, which is, again, the gratification nature, okay? So our first moment, you gotta recognize, is practical reason, and that is the ground of gratification. And then with the gratification, we said that when we're gratifying, we're able to like things, right? And when we like things, that is like a judgment of like. I like this, I dislike that, okay? With this particular sequence, we went from the first moment, which is practical gratification, to the second moment, which was judgment. And the last one, when we like things, we have a reason why we like those things, right? And that reason is borrowed from experience, but that's no longer phenomenal. This is examinable without looking at it, but it is not phenomenal no more, okay? We went from practical reason to judgment to pure reason, right? We went from his second critique to his third critique to his first critique in that dialectical order. None of those 3 are antecedent to the other 2, and we are putting it through a sequence. That's why it has an order. Kant does 1, 2, 3. We could have started at any of those moments and went either way through a dialectic, but I felt that was the easiest for us. So one of the projects that we have here is to put the dialectic back together. This part is hard because you have to really go against your natural inclinations. I want to point out, just as it's customary for us to experience the world with separate objects, it is also customary that we put things in sequences. I would say it's because we're always dealing with causality, and causality makes us want to make reason out of everything, so we put everything in a sequence. Of the 2, causality and sequence, I want to point out that we have never extracted sequence from the pure concept. For us to extract the sequence from the concept, we would have to understand that the sequence is not in its pure form. For the sequence, it has to annihilate itself to become its pure form, because the sequence is making things unpure. Customarily, this is partly because it's always stretched out with causality, right? But when we take pure causality and hold it together and not let it be stretched out, it will become its pure form. I want to stop here for a moment, okay? If you don't get what I just said, then you won't get the rest of the video. And you gotta like be able to not look at time in a sequence, okay? And if you can't get it, it's because you're looking at time in a sequence. Just imagine that I never said the word time, right? And use the word a posteriori synthetic, okay? So just think that the a posteriori synthetic is not in a sequence, okay? We have to extract it from the manifold synthesis because the manifold synthesis will keep things disparate. So when we extract the sequence from the initial pure concept and we just extracted the sequence from the rest of it, what we got with the rest of it is understanding, value, and pure causality in its entirety that is not stretched because it doesn't have the sequence in it. This is a totality with time that is raw. So we arrived with all understanding, all values, all experience, unsequenced. And we call this our conceptual objective experience. This objective conceptual experience has the same rules as the APRI analytic that we started this whole lecture with. How do we know? It's because the experience is irrefutable and the contrary is inconceivable. That's the actual rule of the a priori analytic. Now look at this. Where is the a posteriori synthetic, right? We would say since the sequence has been extracted from the concept, we would say that would be synthetic, right? Where is the a posterior? One thing I did leave out in all this is the transcendental aesthetic, right? That's gonna say that the experience is refutable, right? I was able to leave it out. And the synthesis is synthetic, a posteriori synthetic. And the rule of the a posteriori synthetic is experience is refutable and the contrary is conceivable. So we just went full circle on this lecture, right? But now I want to point out just a few more things. Initially, when we came up with the a priori analytic and the a posteriori synthetic, we had rules, right? Now we could look at it more conceptually. We understand concepts as holding each other together, right? And among those concepts holding things together, they have rules. So you gotta think when we extract the sequence from the pure concept, we could say that those extractions, if we hold those extractions, you could say perhaps pure of each other is going to give us the rules